Alrighty, give me just a minute to take attendance and then we'll go ahead and get started talking about behavioral genetics and evolutionary psych. All right, so before I dive in, just remind everybody that your exam is open. It's due a week from today. So you got some time, you got some time. And it covers the last three chapters we've looked at. So trait theory, learning theory, and then this chapter that we're going to look at now. Yes, yeah, the essay part does, if that makes sense, but not the multiple choice part. Good question. All right, so this is a pretty brief lecture, a couple different reasons. One is that this is still an area where we're gaining a lot of knowledge, right? It's still new. Another is that there's some skepticism that we mentioned earlier in the semester around evolutionary psych in particular, but we're going to try and keep an open mind here. So what's the difference between behavioral genetics and evolutionary psych? So behavioral genetic deals with the possibility that individual differences in psychology are genetic. So things like anxiety disorders might run in families, or if you have a parent who is, very fastidious, you might be fastidious too. Evolutionary psych is aimed at genetic universals. So what are the basic genetic conditions of the species? So we're going to talk about behavioral genetics first. Attempts to explain how personality traits that differ among individuals are passed from parent to child and shared by biological relatives. So behavioral genetics is not concerned with traits that seem to be the same for everyone. It's more, I would say, like an extension of trait theory, right? Kind of looking at individual differences in traits and how that might be biologically related. So it's not going to look at things like the need for food or water. So the big questions here are, can genes influence broad patterns of behavior or personality traits? And if so, how? There is some controversy associated with behavioral genetics, unfortunately, because it was associated with eugenics and cloning. So if you're not familiar with eugenics, this is the idea that we should breed people to create a master race. This is Hitler's idea. It's eugenics, sorry. And so the idea that we can somehow improve humanity through selective breeding. Hitler believed in this strongly, but unfortunately the US has a huge history of eugenics as well. So this is a historical marker for the Indiana eugenics law. Virginia didn't stop its eugenics procedures until I want to say the 70s. And basically what would happen is anyone who was determined to be less than, whether they be a person of color, oftentimes people with what they called like feeble-mindedness, which would be any type of psychological disorder, would have their ability to reproduce taken away from them. So Native women, for example, would go in for what they thought was a routine procedure, and they would have their tubes tied or hysterectomy unknown to them. And this is actually very problematic. Psychologists were really, unfortunately, very much associated with this throughout its history. Modern research, yes, and they put you through menopause if you have one and you haven't been through menopause. So yeah, and like for like the women who had their tubes tied or like had their ovaries removed, some of them didn't know that it happened to them until they tried to have kids later. Yeah, oh yeah, super young. Yeah, no, it was horrific. And justified some really bad research. Like, I don't know if y'all have heard of the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, but this is where they did active research on Black men to test them to see the course of syphilis. And they kept doing this research without treating them, even after decades after there was a cure. So, sorry, it just gives me the heebie-jeebies to talk about that. Really problematic, obviously, but modern research is not wanting to talk about that. Partially because we fully acknowledge personality is determined by more than just genetics, and also partially because we have a much more diversity, equity, and inclusivity and justice focused lens now within psychology in particular, where we recognize that every person, regardless of what's going on with them, has something to contribute. So one of the things that we really look at in this research is heritability, which is a fancy word for saying, is this passed down? So one of the goals in behavioral genetics is similar to any kind of genetic study, whether you're studying something like breast cancer and the BRCA gene, is that you want to compare the similarities between people who are and are not related and people who are related to different degrees. Now, instead of looking at how many people within a family have breast cancer, we'd be looking at how many people in a family have a certain personality trait. The assumption is that traits or behaviors that are influenced by genes should be more similar among more closely related people. So you would be much more likely to share a personality trait with your parents than your second cousin once removed. And this is most often done in research looking at the differences between twins. So monozygotic twins or MZ twins are identical twins. So what monozygotic means is that early on in the development, when you are just a little bundle of cells, the two, what would become embryos, formed out of one zygote. So there's one sperm, one egg, they formed, but for whatever reason, somewhere in the process of dividing, it created two embryos instead of just one. Dizygotic twins are where there are two fertilized eggs. So two different eggs, two different sperms. And so those are what we would call fraternal twins. Now, the really interesting thing about dizygotic or DZ twins is that they are no more genetically similar than any other siblings, right? If you think about it, same mom, same dad, an egg from mom, an egg from dad, but different eggs, different sperm. Sorry, sperm from dad, not an egg. It's a different type of reproduction. And so the idea is, if things are more heritable, they should be much more likely to co-occur in monozygotic twins who share the same genes than dizygotic twins who are only as similar as siblings, but happen to share a uterus and obviously an environment once they're born. So what we're looking at here is, can observable traits, which is what we call a phenotype, be attributed to variation in genetic structure, or the genotype? So phenotype is observable traits and genotype is that variation in genetic structure. And so one of the things that comes out of this is what's called the heritability coefficient, or some people call it the heritability quotient. And so this is a formula that just looks at how related two people's phenotypes are based on their genes. So little fancy formula here. So we've got the correlation between the two monozygotic twins, the two identical twins. Obviously, this would often be done with multiple, right, monozygotic twin sets. And you subtract the correlation between the dizygotic twins. And then you multiply it by 2. I mean, you don't really have to multiply it by 2, which is what they've done to make it more easily readable. But basically you say, how related are identical twins? And you subtract how related are dizygotic twins. And the idea is by doing that, you're controlling for all those things like shared uterus, shared environment. And you should be able to get at the pure genotype. Because again, monozygotic twins, until they get mutations in genes, which happens to all of us due to environmental exposures, have identical DNA because they came from the same zygote. And so this shows how you would do that with a whole bunch of different folks. And if you have twins, like I have a friend who had twins, she lives in Wisconsin, and like she was like immediately contacted by a university. It's like, we would love to get you into studies. Like people love to study twins. I don't think she did it. She was just like, they're babies, which fair. But so you say, okay, let's say we're looking at, I don't know, extroversion, right? Okay, so how did the first twin score on a measure of extroversion? How did the second twin score on a measure of extroversion? So we look at that for all of our identical or MZ twins. And then that gives us a correlation coefficient. And in this case, let's say it's 0.6, which is pretty high actually. And then we do the same thing for our pairs of fraternal or DZ twins. You know, so this first twin and this pair scored a 52 on extroversion, their twin scored a 49. And what we find is that, not surprisingly, it's still correlated, but only at the 0.4 level. So to calculate that heritability coefficient, we're going to take that R from the MZ twins, that relationship between the first twin and the second twin score, and subtract that R from the DZ twins, that relationship between the first twin and second twin score for the fraternal twins. And then that gives us 0.2. And then again, they just decided we're going to multiply by 2, and that means something. Good for you guys. I think it's because there's 2 people. And so the heritability coefficient for whatever this is, again, if we're saying it's extroversion, is going to be 40%. And that means 40% of the expression of that trait, extroversion again in this case, would be determined by genetics. But that still means 60% is determined by environmental influence, right? And so that's really important to keep in mind, is that nothing that we've found is like 100% heritable in terms of personality traits. So what we find is the numbers that were used as examples on the previous slide are about the averages that we find for most things. So when we're looking at behavioral factors like personality traits, MZ twins on average correlate at about the 0.6 level, and ZZ twins correlate at about that 0.4 level. And so the heritability coefficient in general, again, for behavioral things like personality traits, is about 0.4. If you do this with non-twin studies, it's smaller. It's only 0.2. And so that this suggests that the effects of genes are probably interactive and multiplicative and much more complex. I mean, one of the problems, right, is that this is not ever going to be a simple Punnett square, right? Like, it's not going to be like eye color, where there might be one gene that determines it, right? There's multiple genes that would go into determining your extroversion. And so it's going to be pretty complicated. The heritability of adopted siblings who grew up in the same environment but share no genes is about 5%, which just makes sense if we think that we typically find something statistically significant if it's like less than 5% chance of happening on random, right? Makes sense. So what do heritabilities tell us? Why do we bother to calculate these numbers? Well, what they tell us is that genes matter. Not all of personality comes from our experience, right? Even if it's just 40%, that's still 40% that's not purely learned. It also can help us think about the etiology or origins of behavioral or mental disorders. So disorders with very low heritabilities are much more likely to be due to environmental factors. Also gives us insight into the effects of the environment on personality development. So, that shared family environment doesn't seem to matter as much. So here's a clear example where a lot of research has been done, looking at genetics and depression. And we've always known depression has a genetic component. I believe it was Plato or Aristotle recognized that depression ran in families back in ancient Greece. So we've known this for a long time. And so we study it in many different ways. So we might do family pedigree studies. So what you do is you find the probands. The probands are the people with the thing you're looking at. So in this case, it would be the person diagnosed with depression in the family. And that would be the focus of your genetic study. And if depression is inherited, we should see higher rates in family members. So what we find is that as many as 20% of the relatives of those probands who are themselves depressed are also depressed. But the average in the general population is only about 10%. So there is a higher risk. Twin studies we have done here as well. Again, the MZ twins should have a higher rate of concordance than those dizygotic twins. So one study, for example, found the 40% rate for MZ twins, 11% for DC twins. Other studies have found like 46 and 20. Sullivan et al. Did a quantitative review of twin studies. So when they combined all these studies, they had 21,000 sets of twins. It's a lot, right? And what they find is that monozygotic twins are twice as likely to both develop depression than dizygotic twins. So something around 31 to 42% of variance in depression is genetic. That goes back to about that 0.4 heritability, right? Adoption studies are really interesting. So what they do is they'll find adoptees who are depressed, and then they'll go find their biological parents. And what they found is that when you have an adoptee who has been hospitalized for depression, so very severe depression, the biological parents of that adoptee had a higher incidence of severe depression than did the parents of a group of non-depressed adoptees. Another study found that depression occurred 7 times more often in biological relatives of severely depressed adoptees than in the biological relatives of control. So even though they're not being raised with these people at all, right, there is that genetic factor. Molecular studies have really drilled down and tried to find some genes, and we know of at least one. So depressed people have an abnormality of the 5-HTT gene, which is responsible for making serotonin or 5-HT in the brain. We know serotonin is implicated in depression, anxiety, several other disorders. And in fact, a lot of our current antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications target serotonin. So if you've ever heard of SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, they are targeted to increase serotonin in your brain. So what do heritabilities actually tell us? Again, what's all this science and this math telling us? Well, does the family matter? Think again about that adoptive sibling heritability rate of about 0.5 or 5%. So if you look at that and you're thinking about family environment, you might think like, no, extreme conclusion doesn't matter at all. Developmental psychology would argue, yes, of course it matters, right? We know things like attachment and things along those lines. I mean, think about Anna Freud's ideas, things along those lines. Based on technical issues, yeah. Technical issues are the similarity among adoptive families. So the same, if you adopt a child from your culture of origin, the variability is reduced. Based on behavioral observation, yes, families do influence. Based on self-reports, where you ask people to fill out questionnaires saying, did your adopted family influence your depression? People will say no. In self-report, people may focus more on traits that make them different from their siblings rather than on similarities. And so we can kind of think about, it's really complicated, right? And it may also depend on your family situation, right? If you're in a supportive family home, that may influence you less than if your adoptive family is very traumatic, sort of a lot of turmoil. So, okay, we know that genes are affecting personality from those heritability measures, but how? Well, what we think is that genes probably create propensities to act in certain ways. And so with molecular genetics, we're trying to determine whether the differences in traits are correlated with differences in particular genes. The association method. So some of the genes that we've looked at, homosexuality. So most non-straight people within one family had the same gene on the X chromosome, but people who were straight in that family did not. So there might be a literal born this way, right? Behavioral and emotional control. There's this gene called the DRD4 gene, and that affects the development of dopamine receptors. And we know that dopamine is related to our reward system. So people with too little dopamine or the inability to respond to dopamine may crave extra stimulation, be sensation seeking, and we know that's related to certain pathologies like antisocial personality disorder. Neuroticism and depression. So the presence of a gene associated with depressed serotonin function, that 5-HT gene we talked about, we will see stronger responses in the amygdala to fearful and unpleasant stimuli. The amygdala is the part of our brain that deals with emotions. And then there's also differences in how much the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex work together. So the amygdala response, for example, is very strong among people with social anxiety who are asked to give a speech. So it may be that having serotonin gene leads to changes in your amygdala that then lead to behavioral changes. There are cultural differences. So for example, the allele that is related to, allele is like part of a gene that's related to neurotic responding is more common in some cultures than others. So for example, we found it more commonly in Japanese samples than we have in American samples. There are limitations that this may not be applicable to everyone. And again, as I mentioned previously, it's probably not one gene, right, determining these. It's probably a very complex interaction of a bunch of genes. The other thing we have to think about is gene-environment interactions. So there must be an environment in order for there to be behavior. My intro psych professor, when I was a freshman in college, first year in college, expressed this as genes are expressed in an environment, right? And the clearest example I can give about this is, let's say you have the genes to be super tall, right? But you are raised in such abject poverty that you never get adequate nutrition. You might never reach the height you would have reached with adequate nutrition, right? You might only be like my height, 5'4". And so if we can think about that way for physical things, it's easier to conceptualize it for psychological things. So environments can affect heritabilities. We also know, for example, that kids who lack intellectual stimulation, who their parents aren't able to afford books in the house or spend time with them because they're working multiple jobs, or unfortunately, there are some children whose parents purposely neglect or isolate them, right? Those kids who lack that intellectual stimulation or educational opportunities have lower IQs. Now, does that mean that was genetic? No, right? Clearly, the environment influenced that expression. We also know the social environment can affect it, right? So you're someone who maybe has the 5-HTT gene abnormality and you're teased a lot, right? You might be much more likely to develop depression than someone who doesn't have that experience. Also, again, we can think of that with physical things. Let's say, again, I'm 6 foot tall. That would be funny. But I'm teased for it because I'm, an 8th grade girl. I might start doing this, right? And I might actually eventually develop back and neck problems that lead to me not being able to actually stand up at my full height. Sometimes we choose our environment to be consistent with our genetic tendencies. So for example, people who are sensation seeking, who have that abnormality in the dopamine gene, hopefully everything's okay, are much more likely to be sensation seeking and thus might be much more likely to be involved in criminal environments. Also, you could do that in a more adaptive way, right? So they might just be thrill seekers and do extreme sports instead. Sounds like they're just working on something. And the same environment can affect different individuals in different ways. So for example, responses to stressful or boring experiences. Some people will just kind of ignore it and zone out. Other people will eat when they're bored. Some will drink alcohol to excess, right? So everyone's going to kind of react in different ways. So environments can determine how or whether a gene is expressed because genes are expressed in an environment. All right, so that's behavioral genetics. Next, we're going to start talking about evolutionary stuff. And here's where I have a little more skepticism, even though there are some really good things here. But you will understand when I start talking about the mating stuff, why I'm like, but the idea with evolutionary personality psychology is that it attempts to explain how patterns of behavior that characterize all people, all humans, originated in the survival value of those characteristics. So people who had those characteristics would be much more likely to survive and thus pass on their genes to the next generation. So you're applying evolutionary theory to human behavior. It's survival of the fittest, but it's survival of the fittest based on your personality. So characteristics that have more survival value, going to keep you alive, again, are more likely to be passed on because those people stay alive and thus have a better chance of reproducing. But again, this is not always necessarily true, that there are people who deviate, and some traits that are not adaptive have just stayed around. So for example, the human appendix seems to have very little biological purpose now, to the point that you can have it removed and you're fine. But it seems to kind of just be there to go off like a time bomb and almost kill us, right? Not really. Susceptibility to cancer, right? You think we would have bred that out of ourselves? We haven't. Another great example is the giant panda. The giant panda is a bear. So it has a carnivorous digestive tract, but it only eats bamboo. And it's but why? Why didn't that change? I had a friend who actually was an earth and environmental sciences major, and he would just rant about pandas. He's like, why are we spending so many resources on something that doesn't even want to seem to preserve itself?
How did we find out that they were?
I think probably dissections after that's looking at their system compared to other carnivorous versus herbivorous. Yeah. That's really got the proper word. But yeah, so essentially just looking at their anatomy compared to others. Yeah. So what you're doing in evolutionary psychology is trying to identify common behavior patterns and then determine why that was adapted. So again, we're going to look at mating behavior, and this is where the feminist in me cringes. So this is a huge topic for evolutionary psych. Most of the big names in evolutionary psych are old white guys. So just like putting that out there. I know that's true in many of our others fields, but many of our others have fields like we see more diversity in the field and in their big names now than we do with evolutionary psych. So mate selection is one thing that's often talked about, and this is what you look for in the opposite sex. So let me stop right there and fully articulate. This is very heteronormative, right? It assumes that you are going to be attracted to the opposite sex, which for somewhere around 10% of the population is not true, right? And so the idea is that men place higher value on physical attractiveness and younger female mates. They said that men select widely. They basically want to get a sperm to an egg at every opportunity. And then the argument is that women place a higher value on economic security and prefer older male mates. That women then select wisely, that they must be more careful in who they select. So the idea is that both men and women want the highest likelihood of healthy offspring who will survive and reproduce. And the difference is in how this goal is pursued and achieved. So the idea is that female attractiveness may be seen as signifying youth and physical health and thus ability to have children. And that males need to provide economic resources and appropriate attitudes to support a family. Just like putting it out there, over half the households in the US right now have either dual primary providers or the woman is the primary provider. So this idea that we need to depend on men for economics is a little questionable now. All right, so this would then relate to mating strategies or how you handle heterosexual relationships. So differences between men and women, they argue that, there's going to be differences in the number of desired sexual partners, the faithfulness to the partner, the selectivity of partner, and the experience of sexual jealousy. So they've done some research on this, and men report that they'd be more upset at sexual infidelity, and women would be more upset if their partner was had emotional infidelity. So more of like an emotional relationship with someone else. Although 55% of men would also be very upset by emotional infidelity. So imagining your partner falling in love with someone else. And the 55% of men think that they would be more upset by that than their partner having sex with someone else. Just 88% of females said that they'd be more upset by that, but it's still more than half the men said they'd be more upset by emotional infidelity. They also look at factors that affect reproductive success. And again, the idea is that men can just have as many children as possible and not waste time taking care of children that are not their own. And then women finding a man to help support them and the children. Again, very 1950s heterosexual normative, right? And like one of my women's and gender studies professors at college like mapped this out for us, right? Like if this was true and we took this to its extreme, that men just wanted to like spread their sperm as much as they could. Right? I forget the actual math, but she like figured out the refractive period and like how many times a man could have sex in a day and like how many hypothetical children he could father over his lifetime. And it's like, they're not going out and doing that, right? This also circles back around to what my professor Newberry said, is that like, if you want to have children, you have to kind of buy into the family relationship, right? If you want to be supportive. I mean, you can have different ways of doing that. I'm looking at you, Nick Cannon, right? Like he's an outlier, right? But there's certainly other people who have lots of sort of mixed families as well. Yeah.
So, what about, because we're in an age where the nuclear family doesn't really exist anymore, so people have like polyamorous relationships or stuff like that, but they want to include children in it, so how would that work? Like,
Good question. And most evolutionary psychologists don't talk about that. They saw those as like abnormalities. Again, even though, like you're saying, more northern nuclear family is not the norm, and you'll have a lot of single parents or, you know, couples adopting or using surrogates who are not able to reproduce. And again, like there are straight couples who can't reproduce, right? Infertility is a thing. And this doesn't take that into account. Yeah, it's problematic, right? We really start to poke holes with things like that. You know, single moms, and some moms will like get like a sperm donor so that they can have a kid by themselves, right? And like more power to them if that's what they want to do. Yeah, it's really interesting to kind of wrap our heads around this in a modern context, right? Then there is the most Freudian thing to ever enter something that purports to be scientific. The sexy son hypothesis. So this is how evolutionary psychologists try to argue why women might also be interested in mates who are also attractive, right? And they said this is an alternative mating strategy for women. By mating with an attractive but unstable male, they'll produce sexier sons who will be more likely to reproduce and pass down their genes. Yeah, it's everybody's face right now is how I feel about this idea, right? This sounds exactly like Freud's idea to resolve penis envy to me, that like the woman has to give birth to a male child to have the phallus, right? Like it's just bizarre and something that again, like purports to be based on evolutionary theory. To be like, oh yeah, they just want hot sons, so they'll reproduce more. It's a little mind-boggling. And so, as we were just talking about, there are a lot of complications with this. So, one of the norms in our society right now is, you know, and it's changed a little, but it's still slender women, right? And so you have now, I think, sort of the Kardashian aesthetic, but certainly in the 90s, it was more heroin chic and really, really thin. And women who are too thin cannot bear children, like, especially if you're to the point where you have something like anorexia nervosa, your body actually shuts down your reproductive functionings to just sort of keep you alive. So like reconciling that with the thin ideal is bizarre, right? And then attraction, we know, is influenced by way more than physical characteristics, right? We often are attracted to mates because we like their humor, they're intelligent, they're kind, things along those lines. And again, even taking the sexy son hypothesis into account, we know that male physical attractiveness is more important to women than it should be under this theory. And then again, circling back around, shouldn't men go along with women's program if they want to have kids? So evolutionary psychology basically says men are inclined to act like jackasses. But they should want to do or be what women want them to, or they won't be allowed to pass on their genes because women won't select them as a long-term partner to have children with. And if men are so impulsive and they're in the hospital or in the morgue because they are, you know, doing risky things, they're not going to be able to pass on their genes either. So individual differences. Evolutionary psych has really focused more on general human nature, not individual differences. But when they do talk about it, they think about evolutionary reasons for individual differences. So we know that diversity is necessary for viability. Different traits and behaviors are adaptive for different situations. So, for example, having neuroticism, being an anxious person, is really adaptive in a setting where you are actually in danger. So I had a National Guardsman that I treated when I worked at the VA in 2010. And he was going to be redeployed in a couple months. And he said, look, I know that we've recognized I have PTSD, but that's what keeps me alive over there. That vigilance keeps me alive. And I had to be like, yeah, I don't feel like ethically I can treat you and get rid of that for you right now. And so what we agreed is that he would seek treatment after he returned. We also know that openness to experience, for example, might be really great for creative, artistic endeavors. Trying different types of exercise might not be as great if you're like, yeah, I'll try some drug that some person who I don't know at all just handed to me, and I don't know what it's laced with, right? And we also just know, just from like, for example, trying to keep the viability of endangered animal species, that we need genetic variability in order for a species to survive. There's also the arguments that behavioral patterns evolved as reactions to particular environmental experiences, perhaps, and that different environments might result in different behavioral traits. So, for example, one of the arguments I think we talked about during our cultural psych chapter is that because hunting was more emphasized in prehistoric Europe, that might be why we sort of developed more of an independent, individualistic bent, whereas farming and agriculture were more common in countries like China. Now that might be why they're more collectivist. Again, there's some holes in that because we know that to bring down something like a mammoth, you needed the whole tribe, cave, right, group of people. So several possible behavioral strategies may have evolved, and each individual might only have one of those in particular areas. And some behaviors may be frequency dependent. They might adjust according to how common they are. So some behaviors are adaptive only as long as a few people do them. So we think of people like con artists, right? They can do pretty well for themselves, but if everyone was going around like stealing paintings from museums, there wouldn't be a market for it, right? Like, oh, another Van Gogh, woohoo. So, you know, there are behaviors that are adaptive depending on frequency. Also, human nature is flexible. So will biology replace psychology here? This is sometimes referred to as biological reductionism, that everything about the mind can be reduced to biology. We don't know enough about biology right now to do that. But the other thing that's really problematic is that biology leaves out most, if not almost all, of psychology. It doesn't ask important psychological questions, such as what are people actually thinking? How are people influenced by the environment, including other people? So this is why, and I think I've mentioned this in the past, we really look at a biopsychosocial model, where we want to look at biological factors, social factors, psychological factors, and how all of those come together to describe any behavior, but certainly personality. Alrighty, on Monday, we'll have a discussion and activity day. One of your articles I absolutely love, it is about a study not in twins, but in triplets. And it is written by the first African-American woman to get a PhD in psychology, Ruth Howard. So. Alrighty, so we'll end a little bit early today, not that early. Everybody have a great weekend. Enjoy the weather while it stays nice.